The story begins in a ring of MFC that in our world would be the UFC from our world. The fighter who is fighting is Ju Jae-kyung, a man who is a mountain of muscles. He is the current light heavyweight champion, defeats his opponent with ease, leaving his face full of blood. He is known as the strongest man in the world. A boy is watching the fight in his cell phone. He is astonished by what he just saw. The name of this boy is Kim Dan. He is on his way to treat this beast of a man. He is worried for what might happen in this job of his, but tries to be positive and focus on his job because he needs the money. When he enters the room, he sees that Ju is beating an opponent and the audience is asking him to stop the massacre. The beating had too much violence, so they decide to stop him themselves. Dan is so scared by the show he just saw, after calming down a little, Ju saw Dan among the crowd and asked who is him. He stood in front of him, showing the great difference of physiques between them both. Ju said that he wanted no one who he didn't invite in the building, but then his trainer arrived, saying that he was no stranger, but his new physical therapist. Ju asked why they needed one if they already had one, but the trainer told him that he almost killed the last one. Dan was worried by what he just heard, and was worried that this beast of a man could do the same to him. But the trainer told him that as long as he doesn't annoy him, he will be all right. This is when Dan realized why the payment for this job was so good and no one wanted it. He was worried because he didn't want to get hit anymore. He entered a room with him to begin the treatment. He took off his shirt, and we can see that his back is huge. Then we see that his body is huge and fit, expected for an MMA fighter. Then they prepared to begin with the treatment. Dan, the doctor, began by massaging his chest. While in his thoughts, he said to himself that this man was in a whole other level, a mountain of muscles. But while he was massaging his leg, he sensed something that he shouldn't. It was a very hard piece of meat. He noticed it too late and got scared. He was worried by what could happen now. The fighter Ju asked him what he was doing by touching him like that. To this, Dan asked him for forgiveness. He was expecting the beating of his life now. But Ju asked him, why was he crying? And told him to be more careful and keep working. After a while, the massage was over, and the fighter Ju felt more flexible now. Then Dan left home, while Ju thought that he was a little wimp. Then we see how is Dan's life, having several part-time jobs, and living a difficult life in a very dangerous place. He worked as a physical therapist, but his boss wanted to have something more with him. The whole hospital was aware of this, so to avoid problems, Dan was expelled of that job. Also, he has a big debt with some thugs who could kill him at any time, a life that nobody would want to live. So if they don't call him again, his life would be even more difficult. But one day while he was working, he receives a call. He answers it. It was Ju who wanted a massage immediately. If he went there and massaged him right away, he would be paid 5 million wons total. He accepts and hurries to get out of his job. But then we see that Ju is actually having activities for adults with another man while talking to Dan. When Dan arrives to his house, Ju is kicking out the man he was having fun with. He didn't want to leave, so Ju stamps his face to the wall. Dan is very scared by what he just saw, but Ju greets him casually. Then Ju proceeds to humiliate the other man and throws some bills to him. Then Dan and Ju go to his room. That was a mess. Dan only wants to do his job and leave, so he starts with the massage. While doing the massage, Ju tells him that he is addicted to intimate and he has to do it or else he feels he is not going to win the fight. Dan tells him that it is okay trying to avoid the topic. But then Ju reveals why he called him. It was because he wanted him to be his intimate partner, and that's why he offered him the 5 million wons. Dan was offended and told him that he just wanted to do his job. Ju told him that if he is not going to accept, then leave, and Dan leaves. Dan, in his way out, was thinking that he was an idiot for thinking that he was going to pay him that much just for a massage, and thought about what if he accepted, but he was scared because he is a virgin. He is afraid of that, but even so, after thinking a while, he accepts but makes Ju promise that he is actually going to give him the 5 million wons. Ju says that he will, and asks him if he already has been with any other man. Dan thinks that if he says no, then Ju is going to kick him out and won't give him the money. So he says yes, even thought he is actually a virgin. Then Ju lies him down and says that he won't be gentle then. But Dan tells him that he first need to take a bath. Already in the bathtub, he thinks about the situation, wondering how he ended there about to have intimate with a stranger, and thought that if he regretted and left could be even worse because Ju is very violent. Then Ju entered the shower, very angry, took him by the arm and threw him to the bed. Dan didn't want to do it, but he had no other option anymore. So he just let him do his thing while standing still. After a long night of suffering, Ju wakes up and prepares to begin his day, and when checking on Dan, he finds out that he is not there anymore. Then in his combat of that day, he had an amazing performance, beating up his opponent, winning the combat. His trainer was congratulating him in the way. Ju thinks that it was all thanks to the things he did to Dan. So he asks his trainer to hire Dan as his physic therapist permanently. The trainer accepts, without knowing the real reason why Ju wanted to hire him permanently. The following days, Ju was angry because Dan didn't answer his phone. He even asks his trainer why he cannot communicate with him. His trainer tells him that he didn't know it neither, that it seems that Dan has disappeared, that maybe he didn't care about the job, and maybe he blocked him. This makes Ju angry. But then we see that Dan is lying on his bed. We see that he is not okay. He is in a state of depression for what Ju did to him that night. He is even more angry with himself because he let him do all those stuff to him just for money. Then he realized that he cannot stay like that because he hasn't presented to work for several days. Then is shown that he also needs the money because he has a grandma who has cancer and cannot leave the hospital. She is his only family, and this affects him very much because she is like his mother. The doctor tells Dan that the last surgery that the lady had was not entirely successful, so the grandmother is getting worse. He proposed to Dan to do an experimental treatment, but that treatment is not covered by the government and he has to pay for it. And it is quite expensive. Dan was very sad, very disappointed because he had no money. So in order to gather the sum of money that his grandmother needs for the treatment, he decides to call Joe after answered. They saw each other at his apartment, and there they were about to make a deal that consisted of Dan giving him a massage before and after his fights and training, and they were also going to have action every time Joe felt like it. Dan accepted, but he asked him to increase the payment to $14,000 a month. Joe smiles and tells him that he knew it was a matter of money, so he agrees to give him $14 million a month, but with the condition that they will do it whenever he wants and wherever he wants, regardless of whether he will have competition or not the next day. Dan hesitates a little, but accepts the deal because he needs the money, if not his grandmother dies, and that's when it begins. Joe doesn't wait even a little bit and grabs him by the hair and brings his thing closer to him and tells him to work. This brings back bad memories for Dan because it brings back the day that the hospital director wanted him. But even so, he does what Joe tells him to do. Joe does what he wants without caring what Dan feels. Dan has no experience at all and feels like he is going to die. But Joe doesn't care about that and just want to keep going and tells Dan that he has to endure all that and more. Well, he has to work harder on his body to earn the money that Joe offered him. A few days later, Dan goes to see his grandmother. They are already giving her the new treatment. And it seems to be working because his grandmother looks much better. But his grandmother worries because she doesn't know where he is getting the money to pay for this new treatment. And he lies to her. He tells her that he has several jobs and that now he is also the personal doctor of a very famous athlete. This calms down and makes his grandmother a little proud. But the reality is what we know. Even his hip hurts. Later, the first day at the gym for Dan arrives, they introduce him to everyone. Everyone thinks he's too small to be Joe's physiotherapist. Although later we find out that he may be short, but he's bigger than everyone in the place because he's 29 years old. Joe is also surprised by this, along with everyone else, but he doesn't say anything. And then the training begins. Joe is fierce, even in training. He's too aggressive. He has no mercy on anyone. Dan realizes that Joe is too strong, and he gets a little scared, imagining what could be of him if he really gets angry at him. Then starts helping a kid whose shoulder hurts a little, and this makes the others ask him for help too. This makes Dan feel good because he feels needed, and that his job is important, but this kinda made Joe jealous, so he demands that he go with him. He takes him to the showers, and he pulls him, puts him in the shower, and tells him that he needs to do it now. Dan begs him not to do it there. He knows that it's within the agreement that is the agreement they reached, because they have to do it wherever and whenever Joe wants, but he doesn't want to do it there. And even by reflex, he hits Joe in the jaw. So when he realizes what he did from the hit he gave him, he freezes with fear. He apologizes, but he was already waiting for the hit to come back. But Joe doesn't hit him back. In fact, he's happy, dude, because it's been a long time since he received a blow like that in the jaw. But even so, he doesn't stop with what he was about to do. He puts his fingers in his mouth and then in the peach to prepare him. He turns him over. And although Dan begs him again not to do it, Ju doesn't care. He does it. But at that moment, other fighters arrive to shower, and when they see that Ju is there, they doubt whether to take a bath or not. Because they know, at the gym, that Ju doesn't like it when they use the showers while he's taking a bath. But these guys are very sweaty. So Ju tells them that it's okay to shower, but to be quick while the other guys are taking a shower. Ju keeps doing his stuff to Dan. He tries not to make noise because he doesn't want to be discovered. At the end, the guys finish showering and get out of there. And almost at the same time, Ju also finishes inside Dan, tells him to wash up, take a shower, and get out of there. And Dan is left crying in the shower. The next day, the coach gives Dan his uniform. He thanks him for putting up with Ju because nobody can stand him. And actually, everyone treat him well and are happy that he is working with them. They even make him a welcome party. They go to a Korean barbecue restaurant, and there we see more fighters from the gym. Everyone is nice to Dan. They even do an initiation rite for him, which consists of everyone serving him a little of their drink in a large jug, and he has to drink it all. But just when he was going to drink it, and everyone had already served him, Ju appears, who, according to them, he wasn't going to be there, but he suddenly arrived, and serves him more beer, thinking that he won't be able to finish it, but Dan has a deep throat. He drinks the whole jug and everyone gets excited because he drank it all in one go. In the end, Ju ends up taking him home. This is not because he wants to, or is kind, or wanted to help him, but because his trainer gives him this order. He tells him that he has to take him, because he is his physical therapist. So he carries him and puts him in his car, and when he gets to Dan's neighborhood, he realizes that it is a horrible neighborhood. It is a neighborhood that is, in fact, about to be demolished. And so when he enters his house to drop off Dan, he realizes that it is a mess, and he says that it disgusts him a lot, because there is garbage, very few furniture, and Ju says that it stinks of poverty, and that he can't explain in what he spends the 14 million yuans he earns a month, which he already paid him. But in his drunkenness, Dan begins to babble and talk about his grandmother, and Ju seems to realize that's what he uses the money for, his grandmother. But he doesn't leave it there, because the next day, Dan wakes up in Ju's house, in his bed. He doesn't know why he's there. He touches his body and checks his peach to see if he did something to it, but it doesn't hurt at all, so not this time. Then Ju appears and tells him that he didn't even touch it, that he shouldn't worry, but that he didn't touch it because it stank of alcohol. If not, maybe he would. He also tells him that he didn't want to, but he had to take him to his house because Dan's house is not even in habitable conditions, and that he almost vomited when he entered that house. This bothers Dan a lot because he was humiliating him, and he prepares to leave that house. Tells Ju that he will see him at the gym later, but then Ju asks him why he lives in that filthy house in that filthy pigsty. And Dan, between that angry and sadness, with tears in his eyes, tells him what does it matter to him that he doesn't get involved in other people's business. He leaves the place, but Ju doesn't understand why he left so angry, because according to him, he didn't tell lies besides. He remembers the night before, and it is that Dan was the one who asked him not to leave him there because he felt alone, although in reality, he was delirious, and he was thinking that he was talking to his grandmother. But yes, Dan was the one who asked him to take him with him. After the humiliation, Dan leaves in a bus, thinking that he was finally able to pay the interest on the loan, and that if everything continues like this, he will pay his debt at some point. Although he doesn't know how long it will take and how many times he will have to do it with Ju to be able to pay, but then they call him from an unknown number. And it turns out to be from a redevelopment association, because as we know, in his neighborhood, the houses are being demolished, and his is also going to be demolished, but it will be demolished next week. They had warned Dan by text message and by email, but he had no idea, because he hadn't had time to check his messages. Everyone in the neighborhood had already left, and he thought that the redevelopment and demolition of the houses was going to be until next year. So now he has to add that to his problems. The saddest thing is that he promised his grandmother that when she was discharged from the hospital, they would return to that house because they had many memories together there, and now that cannot be fulfilled. But the misfortunes do not go away, because when he gets to his house, the guys he owes money to appear, and Dan asks them what they want, because he already paid them. But they still give him a beating. They say because they are not sure that he will be able to continue paying. And also, that according to them, they do not want to receive money from crimes, because they don't know where they are getting the money from, and they said a lot of excuses. They only wanted to take out their hatred against Dan. The next day, he appears at the gym with an eye patch, and the trainer and other fighters care about him. He says he got hurt falling down the stairs, but nobody believes him. And Ju, instead of asking him how he is or what happened to him, he works directly with him, just tells him that he needs to take care of himself more because he needs to be well for the next competitions. Dan knew that Ju wouldn't care about him, but it still saddens him a little to confirm that he is just a intellectual relief to him. And then they start with their therapy while giving him the massage. Dan asks him for an advance on his payment for the next month, because even though he just paid him, he needs more money, because he needs to move. His house is going to be demolished, and he explains this to Ju, but he tells him no, that he's not his bank. He tells him that he will do whatever he needs, whatever he wants to do with his body, he can do it, and that this will be the first and last time he asks him something like that. But Dan tells him that he needs the money, and then Ju finally agrees and tells him that it's okay that he wants to try something new with him. So he takes him home, and while he's there, he tells him that what he wants to try with him is something he could never try with his previous partners, because it's a toy that was given to him. Dan doesn't have idea of what it is and imagines it's a children's toy, but hey, he just wants something that isn't sadistic. But first, before starting, Ju brings him some wine to relax and prepare what was coming. They used a certain toy that cannot be shown in YouTube, but after all that action, Dan said that he did not enjoy it at all. He even said that he hated it. And when they finish, Dan wakes up because he fell asleep. He asks Ju what's the matter. He has no idea what happened. And he tells him that he's a weakling, who couldn't stand anything, and how does he expect him to pay him in advance if they only did it once? And that he should leave because he's ruining his morning, and he needs to go train. At that moment, Dan gets up and tries to leave, but faints, and Ju doesn't even know what to do. So Ju talks to his trusted doctor, who doesn't say anything and is discreet, and also has the same taste as Ju. When he checks Dan, he freaks out because of all the injuries that Ju did to him. Ju quickly says that it wasn't him, although of course it was him. The doctor tells him that the best thing would have been to take him to a hospital. But Ju being too popular, he couldn't take him and avoid the press. So the doctor also says that Dan is in very bad condition and even presents malnutrition, that he should rest and that he should eat. And then he tasks Ju where he got him from, because he's very handsome. And meeting guys like that is quite difficult. Ju doesn't say anything. He shuts him up because it bothers him. It seems like he gets along well with the doctor. Once Dan wakes up, Ju tells him to get dressed and to accompany him. He prepares dinner for him and Dan can't believe it, because up until that moment, Ju had been a bastard. He had never been nice to him and had never treated him well. And he doesn't know what happened, but he really enjoys that someone had cooked for him, because that hadn't happened for a long time. A few days later, when is Ju's next fight is, Dan goes to the gym and overhears some fighters talking inside the gym. They are talking about a rival of Ju, who is bragging and threatening him, saying that he is going to finish him off. But although Dan seems to be half worried, he remembers that Ju told him that it was not necessary to do anything, just do his part, and that he didn't need him for that fight. But then he receives a call from Ju's coach, who is very upset and tells him that they need him immediately there. The problem is that the fight is not where they are. It's in another city, in Busan. Dan arrives running to the place, and the coach was already waiting for him. When he arrived with Ju, takes everyone out of the place where they were. And the fight is almost about to start. There are only a few minutes left before the fight. Everyone on Ju's team gets out of the way, but they don't understand what's up. He's supposed to only check his shoulder. He says that it bothers him that they're all there while he checks on him, and well, believe it. Although we know that this was just an excuse for Dan to go out there and, well, do +1/8 stuff with him. Even so, Dan still thought that it was an emergency, that he did need his help from his job, but what Ju needed was just his little body. And it turns out that during the preliminaries of the fight, Ju had a confrontation with his opponent. He spit on him. And that upset him a lot. Mean Ju lives angry, but the fact that he spit on him and boasted in front of everyone and the press, it threw him off. It made him very anxious, and that's why he called Dan to do his thing right before the fight. He doesn't want to have any doubts. He wants to win that fight at all costs. That's why he called Dan, even though he had already told him that he didn't need him. And there are some stuff that cannot be shown. In the middle of the act, Ju remembers that he is weak, that the doctor told him to treat him better. So he kisses him, according to Ju, so he doesn't suffer that much. For all that, Ju goes to his fight. At the beginning of his fight, His opponent gives him a very tough fight. The fight is very close. Everyone in the place doubts if Ju is going to win. But Ju, instead of being intimidated, gets more excited to fight someone strong. He makes fun of his opponent a little and gives him a good beating. That not only makes him win the fight, but knocks him out, leaves him bleeding, and in the end, he even spits this on him as revenge for what he did to him in the confrontation. Everyone in the place gets excited. They scream. His coach even cries from the emotion, and Dan realizes that John is someone very important and popular, and many people support him. And he also realizes that he is an impressive athlete that represents Korea in the world. So after the fight, he goes to see him in the locker room and tells him that next time he should tell him with anticipation, so he'll be prepared, and Ju agrees. Dan ends up congratulating him for the impressive fight he had, and Ju doesn't give it importance. Dan is healing from his wounds, and he's also remembering that lately, Ju treats him a little better. He even gave him a cream that helped him a lot with the blows, and that is prescribed by doctors. That's why it's so good. He hasn't been so violent in the act, and he even gave him kisses. In fact, Dan's first kiss was with Ju. However, he should wake up a little, because that day, he has a lot of things to do. But also, he has to get a new house to live. So he goes to a real estate agency to help him, because he doesn't have money to give a deposit. And it turns out that everything he finds is very expensive and very small. Dan didn't even know, not even how much rent cost, because where he lived he didn't pay rent, but everything is out of his loan. But when he was resting and complaining about his poverty, the thugs he owes money to arrive. Meanwhile, we see Ju training and waiting for Dan because he is already very late. He wonders what happened to him and even talks to his coach. He asks him if he doesn't know anything because he was waiting for him to go to the doctor. He told him that in order to know his complete physical condition, he needed to accompany him to the doctor on his next medical checkup. That is why he was going to go with him. The coach tells him that it is very rare for Dan to miss his appointments and that he did not warn them that he was not going to go. So the best thing would be for Ju to stop by his house. Ju tells him no, that it would be better if he canceled the AP ointment with the doctor and that he will go another day. And then we return to Dan, who is inside his house with the thugs, and unfortunately, his friends have already realized the money he has in his account. They checked his cell phone and asked him to give them the money, because they say that he was going to run away with that money. That's why he was looking for another house that he was going to leave without paying. They ruin his plans. They steal his money, the money that he had planned to be able to move and to be able to pay his grandmother's expenses and the interest on the loan. They hit him and ask him where he got so much money. That if he's getting all that money, if he sells his body, and since Dan stays quiet, they assume that it's true. So in addition to continuing to hit him, now they are going to do stuff to him. But at that moment, Ju arrives, and instead of saving him from that situation, he complains to Dan for not answering his calls. He tries to take him to the hospital, ignoring the thugs who are there. And although they tell Ju that they are loan sharks and that they will make Dan pay all the money he owes them, he simply ignores them. Until one of them, in fact, the leader, begins to intimidate and tells him to hit him if he has the balls. Because professional fighters don't know about real fights, and that hurts Ju's pride, he starts fighting with the loan sharks, not because of what they were doing to Dan or defending him, but because they told him that he didn't know how to fight. Ju gives the leader a hard time. Then the fat guy gets in to try to confront him and get revenge, because he thinks he has a chance because he was a fighter before. But Ju gives him a good beating, leaves him on the floor, and finally, this dyed-haired thinks he can do something to Ju, and breaks a bottle on his head. But it's no use. Ju doesn't move or cut, and in fact, he throws him a punch and knocks him out. But then the leader gets up and takes his knife and tries to attack Ju, but ends up beaten by him and even flies out the window. Ju won. He beat them all but left the house in a mess, but that's not all. Because then he goes to the leader, who he threw out the window, and asks him how much Dan owes him. The leader gives him the amount, and Ju pays the full debt, and after that, he takes his toy. In the end, they went to the hospital. Although Ju's doctor was no longer there, Dan worries about him so he isn't hurt, or so they don't sue him, because Ju is a professional fighter. But he isn't worried, because if they do it, the lenders will lose because their business is not regulated and it is illegal. Plus, Ju tells Dan that he already paid all his debt, everything he owed. And this enrages Dan, because he tells him that he shouldn't have done that. It was his debt, it was his responsibility, and he shouldn't have gotten involved where he wasn't called. And Ju gets angry. He tells him that a homeless person like him could never pay that amount, and that his personal problems were already affecting his work. To take it as an advance payment of several monthly salaries, but that he could not allow him to continue owing him and to be left without his work tool, which is Dan. Dan is still outraged because his debt only changed collectors, and he repeats that he shouldn't have interfered in his business, in other people's business. And Ju then gets angrier and tells him to go back with them, then that he will take him, that if he wants, he will take him so he can pay them by opening his legs to them. Also tells him that he helped him. And on top of that, he complains, and well, there he is already brainwashed. Dan ends up apologizing and thanking him for paying the debt and tells him that he promises that he will pay him everything. Ju responds that he knows that he will pay him, that it is clear to him, and that he should put his pride aside, because he should not forget that now it is his property, because he already bought him. And then he leaves there. He tells Dan to go with him, and Dan stays there thinking that he believed that by paying off his debt everything would improve, but that it only got more complicated. So they leave together in June's car. Dan is still worried about his house because he doesn't know where he's going to live, but Ju tells him that now he's going to live with him, that he doesn't have to return to that ugly neighborhood and that horrible house. He takes him to his house, and there he spends the night. The next day he wakes up, still bewildered, and talks to Ju, and he tells him that he will have to continue working for him as a physical therapist, giving him massages, and also doing the adult stuff whenever he wants. That he can use his house and the facilities of his building, but that he doesn't steal anything from him. Dan doesn't know why he's being generous with him. He asks him, and Ju tells him not to think that it's because he likes him or something like that he does it because it's what's best for him, and that he's nothing more than a working tool. Dan thinks to himself that he should pay as soon as possible to avoid being in that house for a long time, because it won't be easy to live there with him. But he has no other option, he has nowhere to live. Ju tells him that he's going to train and leaves, but comes back immediately. He came back just to look for him and take him, saying that he just wanted a little taste before leaving. Dan lets it happen, with a face of sadness and resignation, because he doesn't know how much longer he will have to put up with this. The next day, Dan goes to his neighborhood and sees that they are already demolishing the houses around there, although his isn't yet, so he has time to take out the little he wants to recover, which are memories, photos, and things like that. And then he sees his grandmother's closet, which is really big. It's a gift that he gave her at her wedding. Dan says that it is something very important to his grandmother and that he can't leave it there, let them destroy it, because when they discharge her, she will be very happy if she sees that he recovered it. Although he doubts if his grandmother will be able to leave the hospital, he ends up asking for a moving service to take it to Ju's house, the closet. And when he is about to leave, he remembers the good times he spent there with his grandmother. Although it was a poor house, poor and small, well, he was very happy with her. Everything is a mess, but he says goodbye with nostalgia to his little house already in Ju's house. When Ju sees it, the first thing he asks is, "What the hell is that?" But Dan explains to him not to worry, that he will take it when he leaves his house, when he leaves there, but that it is something very precious to his grandmother. Ju didn't know he had a grandmother. So Dan also explains to him that his grandmother is in the hospital, that she is very sick with cancer, that she is seriously ill, and it seems that Ju's little humanity comes to the surface, and he tells him that it's okay, that there is no problem, that he can do whatever he wants, and he goes to train. Then Dan is left alone in that big house that seems very cold, very lonely, very pretty, the wall too. In short, he feels alone. After 10 days, he still feels strange in the house because he had never lived in a luxurious house, and he doesn't even know how to enjoy those luxuries. He says that it is not very cozy, and that he felt less alone in his poor little house. Besides, he also needs another job. He is locked up there all the time. But he has to pay his grandmother's hospital bill, but he doesn't know if John will be upset about finding another job. Since the other time, they haven't had adult things, because Ju has been training, since in a few days he will have a new fight. So everything has been very calm. But then Ju calls him and tells him that he has to get ready, because that night he will feel romantic, and he's too lazy to prepare him. So he wants him to do it alone. So Dan goes to the bathroom and does it alone. He prepares the back bottom, and although it feels strange for him doing it, then Ju arrives and ends up doing it in front of the mirror. So Dan sees what he is doing to him, but now he felt a bit different. He even enjoyed it. This makes Dan think that now he's used to this life, that Maybe he's a pervert like his abusers, or he doesn't know what's going on. But it didn't stop in the bathroom. They also did it on the bed. They would have done it all night. But Dan got a call from his grandmother's hospital, and because it was so late at night, he thinks it's something serious, that something could have happened to his grandmother. But Ju doesn't want to allow him to answer the phone. He asks him what he thinks he's doing. Dan tells him that he should answer, because it could be an emergency with his grandmother in the hospital, but Ju doesn't give a damn. He says he's not finished yet, and it seems he's not going to let go until he's finished. Dan wants to answer, but Ju doesn't want to let him go or move because he's not finished, and says that there's no way he's going to let him go. Dan tries to get away and says that his grandmother could be dead, that is more important than anything else. So, as best he can, he doesn't give a damn. So he gets out and rushes to the hospital. And when he gets there, the doctor tells him that his grandmother's condition is a little complicated, but that she is quite stable, although she also tells him that his grandmother has been quite restless because she has gone through the chemo and the new treatment on her own. So she recommends that Dan visit her more often. Dan calms down a little because he thought the worst, and then he goes to see his grandma and apologizes. He also tells her that he should have taken better care of her. Then Dan goes back home, but since he rushed out, he left without a sweater and caught a cold. So when he arrives, he sees Ju and tells him that he will take a nap a little, but that he will be ready for work, not to worry. And he lies down on the couch. Then Ju goes for a run like every morning, but being the detestable person that he is, he stays thinking that Dan always does whatever he wants according to him. While Dan has his nap, we see him as a little boy, quite worried and desperate because he can't find his grandmother. He desperately searches for his grandmother until she returns. He hugs her, and with tears in his eyes tells her not to go, not to leave him alone. But then he wakes up and realizes that he has several missed calls from the hospital. They called him again from his grandmother. So he gets up and goes to the hospital, this time with a sweater. Dan runs until he gets to the hospital. He runs to his grandmother's room, and when he gets there, he is surprised because Ju is there with her grandmother. And she looks super happy with him. In fact, she thanks Ju for being such a good friend and so kind. Then they explain what happened. And it is that Ju is there because once he got home, Dan's phone kept ringing, and this bothered him a lot, so he went to see who was talking to him, and it was from the hospital. So he decided to answer the call, telling the nurses that Dan couldn't go at that moment because he wasn't feeling well. This obviously left Dan surprised. Dan asks Ju to talk to him for a moment in private. But he was already leaving for training anyway. Before leaving, Dan's grandma takes his hand and thanks him, smiling for his kindness. Once they are alone, Dan tells him that he shouldn't have gone to all the trouble to go to the hospital because he is very busy with his next fight. But Ju says that he only went to see everything about the hospital and that his grandmother was real to see if Dan wasn't a liar. But Dan repeats that he shouldn't have gone to so much trouble. Although Ju interrupts him and tells him that it wasn't because of him, it was because of his grandmother. Even so, Dan thanks him again and apologizes for having yelled at him the night before when he wouldn't let him answer the phone to go see what was going on with his grandmother. But Ju cuts the moment and tells him that it is the last time he will allow him to leave it unfinished while he is eating his cake. But despite everything, Dan is very grateful and keeps thanking from the bottom of his heart for going and not saying anything. And Ju leaves the place. Then when Dan returns with his grandmother, she and the nurse are talking about how handsome Ju is, how attentive he is, that he is very nice. Dan doesn't believe it. They tell Dan that Ju paid several bills for months in advance for the hospital. This leaves Dan in complete shock because he doesn't understand why he did it or for what purpose. Nobody can be so kind even if they have money to spare, and even he says he doesn't deserve that much. The next day when Ju returns from running, he realizes that Dan made him breakfast. At first, he complains to him and tells him that he shouldn't have done that he is on a very strict diet, taken care of by a nutritionist. But Dan insists that he try it because he is very grateful, and he also knows a lot about sports medicine. Ju, seeing the look of the breakfast, it looks really tasty. So he sits down and eats it. It turns out that it is really delicious, although he is kind of passive-aggressive. He tells Dan that it is very tasty, but that he surely bought it. Dan tells him that obviously not, because he knows how to cook because his grandmother taught him, and that he is doing this to give back a little of everything he has done for him. He says that he will work harder to pay him back everything he owes him. Ju agrees and tells him to have breakfast ready for him every day, right after he gets home from running, and leaves. Then we see Dan in the gym with the other fighters. They are all on a diet because their fights are almost here and they have to meet a specific weight. But since Dan is eating a hamburger, they all stare at him drooling. Ju tells everyone in the gym that lives with Dan, and Dan prepares his daily breakfast in the mornings. Everyone is surprised, but the one who is most surprised is this man who is not only surprised, but kind of jealous. He is called Gwanjung Ji-yu. He is 20 years old, and he is the biggest fan of Ju's fans, but he is the newest one in the gym, and has not even had important fights. Everyone in the gym calls him Potato, and he is like Jin's mascot, but he is jealous of Dan, because he gets along with everyone, and also lives with Ju, although at the moment he says he does not know why this bothers him so much. Dan leaves him there. He goes to the trainer's office, and Potato stays there training, thinking about his love, Ju. But after a while, Ju arrives. They talk a little about the other fighters who have already gone to their fights. But Ju quickly leaves him there and goes to talk to Dan. And Potato accepts that he's jealous, that he wants to be Ju's friend. Ju starts training, and since it's just the two of them in the gym training, Potato asks that if he could help him with his training, he can hold his gloves. He says no because he's not even a beginner yet, and he'll just waste his time. He gets angry and goes to sit right outside the office where Dan is. Dan realizes that something's wrong with him, and they talk a little about how he is and why he didn't want to go with the other fighters to see their fights. But he says that he didn't go because he learns more watching Ju train. Dan says that he would have liked to go see the fights, but Ju didn't let him. This surprises him because he doesn't know why he forbids him from those things. He thinks that they can have a more intimate relationship. But almost immediately he tells himself that it would be impossible. But while they were talking, Ju arrives, pulls Dan by the arm and locks himself in the office with him. This leaves Jong freaked out, and also thinking, why are they making so much noise? Inside the office, Ju is already all over Dan, and although Dan wants to wait until he gets home to do it, Ju got the urge right then and there. He even tells him that he's doing it in public because he knows that it turns Dan on doing it in public places. Joe tells him that he won't leave him halfway. Dan tells him that he doesn't want to do it because it's going to make noise, and the new boy who is outside is going to notice he doesn't want him to hear them. Then he says something, so Ju separates himself very angry, leaves the office, gives his card to Potato, and tells him to go get some coffee. Besides that, he sends him to a really faraway coffee shop. Potato gets excited because it's the first favor that Ju asks of him, and leaves happily for the coffee. Then Ju returns and does his business. While they were checking the papers, Potato called them to find out what kind of coffee they wanted, and Ju thought it was fun to make Dan talk on the phone with Potato while he almost went through him. In the end, they ask for the most basic coffee. Then he hangs up, and they keep going. After this, Potato arrives with the coffees, and Dan is cleaning up all the mess, but he's all tired and sore. Potato imagines that something happened, but he tries to ignore it, although he can't do it much because, at night, he even dreams about Dan and Ju doing it, and him seeing them from afar. This makes him feel uncomfortable for the whole next day, and even gets upset over nonsense that before wouldn't bother him. And then the training begins. Potato, as always, has no one to train with. But then he sees that Dan is trying to practice or throw punches and asks him what the hell Dan is doing. He tells him that he is seeing how the techniques work, so he can better take care of Ju's muscles. Then Potato ends up helping Dan by training with him so that he knows how the movements are. Then Potato tells him that he is envious of him, because he is very close to Ju and he would like to be his friend. But while this happens, he is showing him a chokehold and almost makes him go to another world. All the other fighters notice this and ask him what the hell, what is he doing, and that he didn't notice, asking for apologies. There is a commotion in the gym, and even Ju realizes what is going on. He goes and asks what is going on, and Dan explains it to him. And Ju, when he finds out that he was practicing to see how the techniques work, gets excited and tells him that then he will help him to get in the ring, and that he will do a little sparring with him. Obviously, everyone in the gym freaks out because they know that Ju has no mercy. He even bleeds them. But he says not to worry, that he will survive if he puts on his safety gear. Potato offers himself as a tribute, but Ju denies. So Dan wears the gear and gets into the ring, and the fight begins. On the ring, everyone supports Dan, and Ju explains that Dan will win if he manages to land a hit in 3 minutes. Because he remembers the time Dan gave him a hard time in the bathroom, in the showers. Although Dan knows he doesn't have a chance against him, but still Dan asks what will happen if he wins. And Ju laughs at him, but tells him that he will grant him a wish if he wins. If that were to happen, The sparring session starts, but with a single hit, Ju sends him flying. He literally throws him. Everyone is perplexed and complains to Ju. They tell him not to be so rude. He said he was going to be a little easier with Dan, that he wasn't going to be so rough. But Dan gets up and is ready to continue the fight. Ju says that he likes that way, so he doesn't give up so easily. But Dan is scared he can't even move. Ju has no mercy, takes advantage to punch him hard, then punches him hard in the face, one after another. And he continues to provoke Dan with words, telling him that because he's so weak, the mobsters were on his back. Dan tries to defend himself, but no way can he land a punch. Ju keeps mocking him, he dodges his blows and hits him back. He even knocks him down. And once down, he tells him that even in the ring, he wants him to get on top of him. Dan's nose bleeds, but everyone supports Dan. And he gets up. Ju tells him to bring out all his courage. He probably has enough. But Dan throws a punch without strength, and when Ju is about to finish the fight, Dan hugs him. Unleashing the jealousy and anger of Potato, Ju tells him that it won't work either, but at that moment, the coach arrives with fried chicken for everyone, and that gets everyone distracted, even Ju, and so Dan takes advantage and punches him hard in the face. Everyone sees this. They are surprised. Time runs out, and Dan wins the fight. Then Dan tells him that how he won, now he wants his wish granted. Ju thinks Dan is going to ask for money, but what Dan asks for is for Ju to have a sparring with Potato to train with him, because he knows how much that kid wants to train with his idol. Ju is disappointed with this request, but he keeps his word, and tells Potato that next week they will have their sparring. Dan gets out of the ring, and Potato, with tears in his eyes, thanks him, hugs him, and apologizes for having misjudged him. Ju realizes this and seems happy because Dan didn't give up. After a few days, they go to a checkup with Ju's doctor. They have him doing exercises, they do studies, it seems like he's fine, really healthy, but the doctor tells him that it's not that he's bad or sick, but that Ju doesn't rest, that he never takes a break, and because he is training all the time, his joints are very worn out, especially in his shoulders. So he recommends that even if he doesn't feel so much pain right now, he needs to rest. Dan tells the coach what the doctor told him, that Ju should rest, but he also tells him that he is very stubborn, that he is a workaholic, and that he is not going to rest, even if the coach himself asks him to. So he wishes Dan good luck. Dan says that he will try to persuade him, and, well, when he tells Ju, he gets really crazy, tells him no, that resting is a waste of time, and that he does not agree with what the doctor said. But Dan still insists and tells him that he will even prepare some activities so that he does not get bored while he rests, that he will be with him. Ju grabs his butt and tells him that if they are resting together, only one thing occurs to him. Dan says that there are many other things they can do, but if he wants, he can leave him alone. But Ju tells him that he can't back out anymore. He is curious to know what Dan is going to prepare for his day off. Dan doesn't have the slightest idea of what to do for his day off, because obviously he doesn't know Ju, he doesn't know what he likes, he doesn't know what his hobbies. He only knows that he likes to fight, that he's a high-performance athlete, and that he likes to check peaches with him, nothing else. So he doesn't even sleep, thinking about what it could be for the day of rest, because it's the next day. The next day, Ju asks him what he has prepared for that day of rest. Dan tells him that it should be something quiet, so he brings some board games. Or if he wants, they can meditate. Ju prefers board games, and they start playing, but Ju is a complete idiot at all the games. And with Monopoly, he even tells Dan that he's cheating, and he gets up from there indignantly and goes to swim. Ju loves to swim. In fact, that's why he lives there. Dan sits on the edge of the pool to keep him company, and Ju pulls him into the pool, but Dan doesn't know how to swim and gets very scared, although Ju tells him no, exaggerate that the pool isn't that high. This obviously embarrasses Dan a lot, and he prefers to get out and sit on the edge of the pool, but while he's there all wet, Ju sees him, observes him, and gets heater, approaches him and tells him that it would be a shame not to check on him on his day off, after some content that YouTube doesn't like. When he wakes up, it's already night, and he goes out to look for Ju. He's on his couch watching a movie, and when he turns around, Ju is wearing some glasses, and Dan thinks that he looks good, damn cool. Ju invites him to watch the movie with him. Dan is a little surprised because he didn't know that he liked watching those kinds of old movies. Ju says that he watches them when he can't sleep. They talk a little more. He tells Dan that he won't have any more days off because he's the champion. And to be a champion, he needs to try hard much more than any other person. Asks him to no longer insist on the breaks. They also talk about the wish that Dan asked for in the ring when they fought, because Ju can't explain why he asked for that wish for Potato. Dan explains that it made him sad to see him all sad for not being able to train with his idol and have him there in the same gym. That's why he did it. And Ju asks him what he would have asked for if he hadn't done that for Potato. If he tells him he maybe could grant it. He didn't ask for anything for himself, and Dan, between words more or less, tells him that his wish is for him to use a condom to do their thing, because it feels very strange when he finishes inside him and that everything remains inside the peach. Ju tells him that there's no way he can fulfill that because he likes it raw. This talk makes them turn on and start checking down there. It seems that Dan no longer feels so raped by Ju. Then is shown a very handsome, tall pinhead, who apparently is an actor, and Ju is his personal trainer. The next day, while Dan brushes his teeth, Ju enters his bathroom to brush them too because he ran out of toothpaste. And for some reason, Dan feels strange in the presence of June. He even blushes because he walks around in his underwear. Not even he knows what the hell is happening to him. Then they go to the gym, and everyone talks about Choi Hee-sung. He's at the gym, he brought food to everyone, and everyone is really happy. So they explain to Dan, who doesn't know him, that Choi is a very famous actor, one of the most popular of the moment, and that Ju is his personal trainer. Whenever he goes to the gym, he trains with Ju and he brings food to everyone. That's why they love when he goes. Dan doesn't even know who he is. Apparently, he's not very knowledgeable about show business. But he goes to see Ju, and when he enters, he's already training with Choi. And the coach from the gym explains to him that he's a very famous actor, and since he's from the same talent agency as Ju, that's where they met. And that's the only person that Ju trains personally, besides the fact that Choi pays quite well. When they finished training, Choi wanted to continue because he was having a lot of fun with Ju. But he tells him no way that his time is up. But even so, Choi makes them take a picture for their social networks because people love to see them together. Ju reluctantly takes a picture, and when he sees how he poses, Dan blushes again, apparently starts to like him. Then Choi's hand hurts. Dan notices this, and tells him that he can help him if he lets him see his hand to check it. While he checks his hand and tells him that it's nothing serious, that he probably just hit it wrong. The actor with the pink hair is smitten with Dan. He loved him. He thinks he's really handsome and asks him his name and introduces himself to him. At that moment, Dan recognizes him because he's an actor from a novel that he used to watch with his grandmother, and Choi was enchanted by Dan so much that he even tells him that he hopes to see him the next time he comes to the gym. Dan tells him that it's cool that he's fine with that, but he kind of gets uncomfortable, and Choi keeps asking him questions, like how old is he that he looks younger and so on. But while that conversation is happening in the back, there is Ju watching them, and apparently he is very angry and jealous